Welcome to the history of Bristol Docks in the 19th century by me, Mr. Kennett. In the last video, we saw how Bristol was booming in the 18th century due to the transatlantic slave trade. Ships were coming into the city, trading goods from the Americas like sugar and tobacco. But saying that Bristol was booming in the 18th century is to an extent true. But towards the end of the 18th century, some problems began facing the docks. The story of the docks in the 19th century really is a city trying to overcome a series of problems and not being fully successful in doing so. As I'm sure you know, Bristol has one of the greatest tidal ranges in the world. The tide goes up and down on a huge daily basis. In fact, Bristol has got the second largest tidal range in the world, between 12 and 14 metres difference between high tide and low tide. And that was a huge problem for a city built on ships trading goods. Due to the tidal range, ships needed to be careful when they came into Bristol, as they needed to ride the incoming tide into the city. Then, when in the city, ships needed to be really careful to tie up on the port side. And they needed to get their cargo off quickly or tie them up really properly inside the boat. Because if not, when that tide reduced and the ships reduced with it, the ships would run aground on the mud of the bottom of the docks. And as a result, the ships would often keel over and the cargo would run around and roll around inside the boats and potentially ruin. And that's where the phrase ship shape and Bristol fashion comes from. Now, that tide had always been a problem for Bristol. But in the 18th century, other ports started reducing similar problems. In Liverpool in 1715, a wet dock was created, an enclosed harbour where the tide was controlled to be the same height all the time. That was perfect for ships and in return for the merchants. And by 1800, competition from other ports like Liverpool and the continuing existence of Bristol's huge tide meant some merchants had begun to leave Bristol for other ports. Bristol needed to do something drastic, and something drastic was what they did. This was the time of the Industrial Revolution. And Bristol asked for engineers to suggest ideas to solve the tidal problem in the city. And lots of ideas came flooding in, which ranged from the wacky ones, where one engineer suggested damming the gorge here. But there were also some far more sensible options. The most sensible option and the winning idea came from an engineer called William Jessup. And William Jessup created what we now call the Floating Harbour. The Floating Harbour's construction began in 1804. And Jessup's plan would take 5 years to complete at a cost of the time of £600,000, a huge fortune at the time. His plan was simple but hugely ambitious. He recommended that the Avon was dammed with locks at Hotwells at this end and Totterdown, which is now by where Temple Meads is, at this end. And by damming the river, he would create a tidal range in the middle that wouldn't drop and wouldn't rise. The tide would be the same height in the middle of the river at all times. But the river itself needed to flow somewhere because it was coming down from Bath and then it needed to go out of the Avon Gorge. And so between 1804 and 1809, a new cut was made for the tidal river to pass around the city. And this new cut was nearly 2 miles in length, and the rock and the earth was dug up along its entire length at huge huge effort. And the navvies who cut this out over 5 years by hand cut essentially a new tidal river for the Avon to flow by. And to an extent, this industrial marvel worked. The tide in the city was solved and now remains at a constant height. This allows the ships to float, and that's why we call it the Floating Harbour. And that feature allowed trade to continue. And so boats came into the city, continued trading in the city, and continued trading in the city the goods that they had been throughout the 18th century. And from the Americas, sugar was brought into the city. And as a result, the city continued to grow. And it grew, and it grew, and Bristol continued to grow throughout the 19th century. But things began to change in the 1830s. Firstly, in 1833, the slave trade ended as the government banned the use of slaves on plantations. And although sugar production in the West Indies continued, actually its significance in Bristol dwindled. Yet despite this, the docks industrialised and the city grew. And another engineer came to Bristol, one who is now synonymous with Bristol itself, Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And Brunel led the process of industrialisation. In the 1830s, he helped design sluice gates here at Underfall Yard to deal with silt in the docks. And in 1840, the Great Western Railway arrived in the city and brought trains to Bristol for the first time, and Temple Meads opened up here. And Brunel began designing absolutely revolutionary ships. And the ship that really made him incredibly famous in Bristol was the SS Great Britain, which was built at the Great Western Dockyard here. Now, up until this point, ships had been made of wood. And wood was not a great product to make ships of, because it meant that ships could only be built to a certain size before the wood warped. But the SS Great Britain was made of iron, and that was revolutionary, as it meant ships could be made much bigger. And this was great for ships, and it was great for Brunel. But it was terrible for Bristol, as this becomes its second major problem of the 19th century. The problem was that geographically, Bristol was, putting it politely, a little screwed if ships got bigger. Let's zoom out and look at a map of where Bristol is in the West Country. As you can see, Bristol is 8 miles downstream of the Avon. 8 miles downstream along the Avon before you get to the Severn estuary here, which can then take you out here to the sea. This means that all ships in the city need to come down this stretch of the river before they get to Bristol. There's a problem with this, and that problem really is here, because this is the Horseshoe Bend. And the problem is that ships, big ships, cannot get round that Horseshoe Bend. They struggle to get round the bend before they hit the mud and the sides. In fact, the SS Great Britain is the biggest size of boat that can just about make it round. And even that was a struggle. So as ships got bigger, it meant that less and less trade was coming down to Bristol. Now, Bristol merchants realised this, so in 1877, they built a port here so they could continue trading with bigger ships. And that port is still trading to this day, and that is Avonmouth. But Bristol itself didn't just give up and accept its decline. Let's go back into the city. In 1872, Bristol continued to keep developing. Let's take out Brunel and take out the SS Great Britain. Because in 1872, the Bristol Harbour Railway was built. And it connected Temple Meads with the docks. And in 1870, if I can find it, yes I can. In 1870, a series of new steam cranes were also built along the docks. And they were great because they could lift unbelievable weights. And one of them, this one here, still remains in situ today. And that allowed cargo to be quickly removed from the ships that came into the docks, put onto the railway, taken to Temple Meads, and then taken across the country. And the actual goods that they were trading in Bristol shifted too. As we've already heard, sugar was less of a dominant product. And as a result of that, Bristol merchants started trading different things. Significantly, timber became a really prominent product in the city. And in addition to that, let me just grab my little bit of paper. Grain also became the other dominant goods in the city. And grain warehouses can still be seen around the docks today, like the famous Byzantine granary building near Welshback. But despite these problems, although the city itself was continuing to grow, and it really did massively grow, and I cannot draw on all of the houses that would have grown in the 19th century. But Bristol as a city is hugely, significantly growing throughout. But despite the fact that Bristol as the city was growing, the docks itself were not. Although in 1900, at the end of the 19th century, more trade was happening in Bristol itself than at Avonmouth, really, the fate of the docks was sealed. This is a story of decline.